Okay, so it's 9 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. So, just a reminder, don't forget your Unit 2 assignments are due by tomorrow. That is your essay source annotations, your chapter quizzes, your midterm, your discussion board, and or current event if you are doing it for this unit. I put a recording of chapter 9 on there, so there should be a recording for chapter 7, 8, and 9, and then I'm also recording this one right here to help y'all out. So this chapter shouldn't take too long. It's actually a pretty short chapter, and it's related to our news media and our internet. Now, why is this in our political studies? Because the news media plays a huge influence into our political system and how it works. It has been used very much as a tool from the beginning in colonial times as a way for Americans to get what is going on within the nation, politically, economically, socially, all those different things. So, the news is mainly an account of timely, dramatic, or compelling events. So, a lot of emphasis is usually placed on these dramatic events with our news media because that is what catches our viewers' attention the most. The early partisan press was subsidized by political parties. So remember that partisan means political party. So every time you see that word partisan, it means political party. So this just means that political parties had been, and still do to this day, giving money to our media and different news outlets, newspapers, TV, internet, radio, all those different things. So technological innovation helped bring about the gradual decline of partisan newspapers. So basically what that is meaning is that we have had a lot of different inventions throughout our time. The telegraph, where they communicated through Morse code. They even had a telegraph that ran through the Atlantic Ocean, so that way they could communicate with Europe. We also had things like the telephone and TV, internet. All of these different inventions made everybody one step closer to be able to get their news in real time. It made it faster and more efficient over time, which is why our news is such a huge influence in our political parties. We also had something known as yellow journalism. So what yellow journalism is basically in a nutshell is that it is sensational news. In other words, they sensationalize everything. They make it very dramatic to try and increase their circulation and their profits. In other words, try to get people to read their stories more. And this is really known throughout the use of the Spanish-American War. One really targeted event during that time period was the USS Maine. So the Spanish-American War, just to give a little bit of recap, that was a war between the Spanish and the Cubans over Cuba. Cuba wanted to be independent from the Spanish. The Americans worked their way in because they wanted to have control over the Western Hemisphere with the Monroe Doctrine. And so they pretty much inserted themselves into the argument to try and get the Spanish out of the Western Hemisphere. They had a boat over there known as the USS Maine. It got blown up, and nobody really actually knows who targeted the ship, if it was indeed the Spanish, if it was by fluke one of the Americans, or maybe even the Cubans. Nobody has any idea who sunk this ship. But the press during that time targeted that event, and they used it to get the attention of the American people and to basically pull them into supporting the Spanish-American War. And they did this by making it seem like the Spanish were the ones who had sunk that ship, thereby making them angry, saying, the Spanish are attacking us. We can't just sit here and do nothing. We have to do something. And so that got a lot of people's attention. So there's also another thing known as objective journalism. So when you see the word objective, that just means there's no bias. This is strict facts. So this is based on the reporting of facts and of both sides of the partisan debate. Remember, partisan political party. So it's both sides of the political party's debate. So until the 20th century, that's the 1900s, the print media were the only form of mass communication. But by the 1920s, we had hundreds of radio stations. What ended up happening, though, is at first these radio stations weren't regulated. And so whenever people started first using these radio frequencies, they often interfered with one another. It's kind of like whenever you're driving between cities and you are listening to the radio and it kind of fades out and you start hearing the two radio stations conflicting with one another, trying to take control of the frequency, basically. That is what was going on during this time period. So we saw the creation of the Federal Communications Commission, and they are the ones that actually took over giving each news station their own frequency and organizing all those different things. So then we had television. So this was in more than 90% of the homes by late 1950s. This completely changed the game. This is the reason people say that John F. Kennedy got into the political office as president. Because they say that it was his charismatic nature, which you can't really see on a radio, right? But you could see that on a TV. And they say that's what really won him his votes and got him into office. So it made a huge difference in how the American people really started to view politicians. It also imposed the fairness doctrine. So this is basically saying that each party has to get equal time on each TV, radio, news station. This is obviously not in effect anymore today. But one of the things that it did do was it allowed for people to be able to get a shared set of facts transmitted through the news media. In other words, you only really had to watch one news source in order to get the viewpoints of both the parties who were running for office or trying to keep people's support or trying to pass an amendment, all those different things. And so with this, people only really had to watch one news station. Imagine having to do that today, right? It'd make our lives so much easier with the fact that TV stations are very biased, which we'll get into, and you kind of have to go and watch both of them, read both sides of the news story, try to get the middle ground to see what's actually going on. Back in the 1950s, 1960s, they didn't have to do that. It was all basically just a package of everything in one. And so the Fairness Doctrine came to an end in 1987, and we started to see newscasts drop from the radio stations, meaning the radio stations really stopped airing the news. It became more of a field within the TV stations, and then we had partisan radio talk shows really start to emerge. It seems like NPR and different radio stations that talk about different political events going on. I remember whenever coronavirus was really starting to hit, I listened to NPR all the time trying to see what was going on with the coronavirus and everything. So it's a huge way for people to be able to get their people's take on what is going on within the nation. We also have cable news channels. These, remember, are not subject to this fairness doctrine anymore. So they are very much leaning one side or the other. So we have Fox News. They are a very partisan conservative format. Remember that conservative is not necessarily mean Republican, but that it is associated with the Republican Party, which is why they say conservative. And then the partisan liberal format is seen as an alternative to Fox. And this is with MSNBC and CNN. And that is the Democrats. Okay? So partisanship is also seeped into comedy programming. We've had liberal host Trevor Noah with The Daily Show. We especially saw a huge rise in political commentary with Saturday Night Live with the election of 2016. It has definitely permeated a lot of our television shows and even different shows. If you're watching a series on Netflix or something like that, especially if it is more closely aligned with what's going on within America, you'll see a lot of highlighting on the immigration debates, those global warming debates and everything really start to take hold. So it's permeated our TV and our social media a lot, which we'll get into. So the internet expanded Americans' media options even further. So this has been both a good and a bad thing. I say good thing because it's given people easier access to what's going on. Therefore, it has raised interest in what is going on politically. So I would say that's a good consequence of what has happened within our social media. People have become a lot more plugged in politically. So I started teaching political science about 5 or 6 years ago. And there is a huge difference between how much my students paid attention to what was going on politically back whenever I first started until now. People are a lot more tuned in to what is going on. And a lot of this has to do with social media. Why do I say it's a mixed blessing though? Because people tend to not fact check. There are a lot of stories that are passed through our internet that are not true, especially through social media, because those news outlets are not regulated. And so I'll never forget, I had one student came up to me, Professor, I just found this crazy news story. And so we looked at it together. This is when I was teaching high school. It was for a dual credit class. And he showed it to me, and it was a news story he had seen on Facebook about Colorado executing people by ripping their heads off. This was obviously not true, but I had him fact check the news story, showed him how to do it, all these different things. But that is one of the issues with our social media. So as it has opened up people's access to the news, it has also led to a lot of misinformation and without the fact checking that you need to make sure you're getting the right answers. So foreign actors have also been known to be involved in our partisan messaging. We have had instances, both in the presidential campaigns of 2016 and 2020, of outside countries trying to influence the outcome of our elections through our social media, through paid political ads, trying to influence the outcome of our election the way they wanted it to go. So that has also become another consequence of the such high use of the internet. So the news media operate as gatekeepers. So they actually decide as what makes the news. So you're essentially having our news outlets picking and choosing what they're going to talk about, report stories about, and what they're not. So the reporting is shaped by the needs of the news organizations to attract an audience. So a lot of this has to do with meeting people's informational needs. In other words, keeping the information flowing, especially on very engaging topics like COVID. A lot of people were paying attention to the internet a lot during that time frame. Also playing to their partisan bias. We see a lot of this on news stations like CNN and Fox, where they are trying to cater to an audience that they have targeted and feeding their desire to be entertained, which that's why you see a lot of sensationalizing, both on CNN and on Fox, that are basically, they trash the whole other party almost all of the entire time. And they're trying to really keep their audience's attention by making all of these very crazy scenarios and exaggerating things. So the news media press have traditionally performed three functions: the signaling function, common carrier function, and the watchdog function. So the signaling function basically alerts the public to important developments as soon as they happen. So some events today enter the news through social media. So the signaling function, basically, this is what alerted the American public on 9/11. A lot of people were watching the TVs. 9/11 happened whenever I was still in school, so I remember it was on in a lot of teachers' classrooms. They were watching what was going on. That was the signaling function. Same thing with COVID. Whenever it first started coming out, every development that happened, you would hear it through our news outlets. That is the signaling function. They also influence what is on people's minds by often covering the same stories. So in this way, they are able to kind of try and influence the way the story is going. Again, we see this a lot through our partisan TV shows, trying to cover the story in a way to blame a different political official, especially on the other party, if it's something that is hurting the nation, or trying to make the political parties that they support, trying to make them look good and saying, oh, we did this, this, and this. So they do a lot of that by the agenda setting function within their signaling function. So the common carrier function, this serves as a conduit through which political leaders communicate with the public. So basically, this is the way in which political leaders talk to their constituents, talk to the public, talk to their voters. So national news focuses largely on top political leaders, particularly the president. You notice that a lot of people pay attention to the presidential elections, correct? There's a lot of attention on our presidential elections. Even though we do also have congressmen that run during that time period, we usually have some state elections running at that time, state congressman elections that are running at that time. But people's attention tends to go straight to the president. Okay, so the norm of partisan neutrality and the shrinking soundbite both act to blunt politicians' efforts to manage the news. We also have framing. So this is the way events are cast in a particular light. So especially if this is something that is going on that the party wants to blame the other party, or maybe you have somebody trying to blame another country, or we're trying to get support for different things going on. This is how our media outlets focus their attention, so that way they can try and bring out the best outcome for their party as much as possible. We also have priming. So this is the way an established context affects how people will interpret messages they receive. So the way a story is presented. Okay, so like I said, this is a huge tool of our media outlets. We don't see it as much in media outlets that don't really support one political party over another, the ones that are more neutral. We see these things mainly in our partisan news outlets. So the watchdog function. So this is exposing officials who who violate accepted legal, ethical, or performance standards. So one of these that is very famous is Nixon's cover-up of the burglary at Watergate Hotel. So remember way back when Nixon's party had broken into the other party's office at Watergate Hotel. They were trying to obtain documents that would help them to win the next election. But what ended up happening was they had gotten caught at the Democratic headquarters. So Nixon was a Republican. They were at the Democratic headquarters. And Nixon got targeted by the media outlets. This is why I say they have a huge, huge, huge influence, because the outcome of their stories destroyed people's trust so much with Nixon that he was basically given two options. Either he stays in office and he was going to go through an impeachment trial, of which he was most likely going to get impeached, or he could resign. And he chose to resign because of the negative press that an impeachment trial can put on an individual. So our media acted to bring Nixon to light on something that he was doing that was unethical with his Watergate hotel scandal. We also have Mr. Bill Clinton. So Mr. Bill Clinton, a lot of students that I have, they weren't really even born yet, are old enough to remember everything that happened with Bill Clinton, but they know Bill Clinton. Why? Because there was such a huge media coverage on his affair with Monica Lewinsky. Everybody still knows this today. This is another major example of the watchdog function. He was violating ethical standards, whether they actually actually represented his ability to be president or not. But the media coverage was so intense on this affair that it had a huge effect on his presidency. So because of this, critics have questioned whether the press is overly zealous, turning minor transgressions into major stories. So this is part of their sensationalizing, trying to keep their attention of their viewers. And so they tend to, if they find something that they can sensationalize, they run with it, because that is how they keep their viewers' attention. So we also have the partisan function. Remember, partisan, that means political party. So this acts as an advocate for a particular viewpoint or interest, okay? So today a large number of media outlets operate in this way. Most of our TV stations lean Democrat or lean Republican. You see that a lot in their programming. Even in the way they write their TV shows, they'll usually take a stand on some things. We have radio and television partisan talk shows. These are the most visible form of this type of media. And then outrage is the selling card. So media will tend to use, just like they did with that USS Maine trying to get the Americans really angry with the Spanish, they tend to try to find something that will get their viewers' attention. So a more recent example of this is whenever there were the separation of families at the border. So a lot of people, when this was first happening, were outraged that they were separating parents from their children. And the media was focusing their attention on this act and taking a stand, whether for or against immigration reform. So as cable TV spread, there was a theatrical style of news that kind of came about, and it was aimed at the marginal news consumer. So basically, it labeled soft news to distinguish it from the traditional hard news stories. And CNN is a cable news network that most fully treats news as a form of entertainment. That's what your book says. I would say that I believe both Fox and CNN do that. They both kind of take a side and run with it. So the soft news, this is what is considered that sensationalized news. It's not really based more on facts. It's more based on something that's going to get their audience's attention. And that is different from those hard news, which is more objective. So the soft news, I'll put in here, it is subjective. It is to get their audience's attention and to entertain. That's a huge aspect of it. And then traditional hard news stories, these are objective, meaning these are more fact-based and they are informational. Okay? So, news as entertainment is most clearly seen in humor programs that focus on current affairs. Trevor Noah on The Daily Show, he likes to highlight different things that have happened and make a joke out of them, especially with things that he does not agree with. Then we have, the difference in choice media systems. So until the 1980s, Americans had 3 TV networks. Remember that during this time, this was also operating under the Fairness Doctrine, which means that you could watch one TV channel and get the news from both political parties' sides with equal time, meaning that you did not have to spend your time going between all the news stations trying to find middle ground. And there were only 3 TV networks. Think about how different that is from today. Right? Compared to today, we have the high choice media system. We get our news from WFAA. I use that app a lot to get my news. We do get our news stories through Googling different events that have happened. Some people have a news station that they refer to, some of them being Fox, some of them being CNN. Some people get it through their social media. Some people get it on YouTube. There's news channels on YouTube. There's all kinds of different sources you can go to gather your news. Okay, so there's multiple places to go for information. So one thing that happens though with this is people tend to stay within news stations that are going to support their views. So what I mean by this is that very strong Republicans tend to choose the news stations like Fox that are very strong Republican based and only get their news from that source. People who are very strong Democrats, same thing, but they usually go with CNN, right? A very strong Democratic source. Bad thing about this though is that this tends to lead towards a lot of bias because, again, these news networks sensationalize, and it doesn't leave a lot of wiggle room in trying to find the objective story, meaning the actual facts of what happened. So, for example, whenever I teach my political science classes, I try to teach purely facts. I don't like to give a lot of my own opinions on things because I like for my students to be able to have their facts and be able to come to their own conclusions based on what they've learned. But you cannot do that if you're watching, say, like Fox or CNN because they give what happened and they also give their take. And this influences a lot of Americans on how they view the news stories. And this is what has really contributed to our partisan polarization that we've been talking about all semester, where people go to being very extreme Democrats and very extreme Republicans. The amount of moderates and independents that we're seeing is going down. And people are going more towards the polls, meaning they're very strongly associated with one party or the other. And this has to do with controlling what they're seeing, controlling what they're hearing, and choosing to not go to the other source to try and find a middle ground or try and find a better source. So I always get the question of what's a better source? So one of the areas you can go to is if you go to the internet, you can search out BBC. BBC is a great source. They still tend to lean liberal. They tend to lean towards those democratic views, but whenever they report on what is going on in the United States, because they are an outside nation, meaning they are looking in on what is going on in the U.S., they tend to report more of the facts instead of inserting their opinions. So that's one thing you can do. Finding international news stations and the way that they are reporting on the U.S. Because they tend to just give the facts. That's one thing you can do. Another is consciously, if you're catching, especially if you're catching yourself going towards just one direction, whether it be more Democrat or more Republican, and just getting your news from that, even though if you're a strong Democrat or a strong Republican, watching the other side, might anger you, might frustrate you, but at the same time, you're also getting the other side's story, right? You're getting what they are seeing. So from that, you are able to take that information and come towards more of a middle ground. So those are usually a couple of my suggestions on how to do that. And be conscious of, if you are on your social media especially, fact check. Fact check, fact check, fact check. You cannot do that enough. It's so many sensationalized stories out there nowadays that you really have to check everything. So, traditional audience. So, the audience for traditional news outlets is significantly smaller than it was at its peak. So, when we're talking traditional news outlets, these are things like TV, radio, newspapers. Most people use the newer outlets, right? Things like Facebook, Instagram, other internet news sources. So younger generations tend to focus their attention on these newer outlets. Okay, so again, it's good because they're getting more access to their news, but bad because they're also getting all that misinformation. The traditional news outlets, these are where our older Americans or older generation Americans tend to get their news from. We've seen a lot of newspapers especially go online. One, to save costs on printing, but two, because that's how they can try and pull in these newer audiences. So the problem with this is that on either side is that older generation Americans, remember that fairness doctrine did not leave the media until 1987, right? So a lot of these older Americans, as they were growing up, they're used to having TV stations, newspapers, what have you, giving both sides equals time, right? Being less partisan. But what you see happen a lot of the time now is they still use these TV stations, these radio stations, those that are left, these newspapers, especially if they read them online, but these are no longer regulated by that fairness doctrine. So we especially see even at these, with these older generation individuals, they tend to also be very strongly politically leaning one way or the other because they're not really aware as much of this phenomenon that's going on because it's more of a newer concept. And it's become a whole lot worse, I would say, within the past 5 years. A whole lot worse. So, heavy consumers of traditional news, newspaper reading in particular, are the best informed. So these are ones that tend to look at less biased news sources, basically ones that are not as sensationalizing with the news. Most still fall short of being highly informed with politics because the sad thing is a lot of the news stations within America are very partisan. A lot of them are very, very partisan. So because of that, there tends to be a partisan spin on nearly everything you see. So it's hard to get the whole picture. So that's why I say you read it from multiple angles because most people do not read from multiple angles to get a whole picture. So what you need to do is, especially if you just want to stick with domestic, meaning national news stations, watching both CNN and Fox over the same news story and try to find the middle ground, something that's closer to the truth. So citizens often, not everybody, but citizens often don't study the news. They follow it. We're a very busy society, right? I know myself, I'm up, I go to class, I drive to class, Mondays and Wednesdays, I drive up to Gainesville High School. I drive over to Dallas College campus. I drive home over in Fort Worth where I live. And during that whole time, I can listen to NPR, but I don't have time to be sitting there on my phone because, I'm sitting there preparing my lessons and all those different things during that time. The minute I get home, I got 3 kids. I take care of them, help them with their homework, prepare my lessons for the next day, help my husband make dinner, make sure the kids get to bed. Nowhere in that time frame do I have time to be able to take an hour or two and look at all the news stories and find the middle ground, right? And I'm sure y'all have very similar or things that keep you busy, right? So because of that, especially with today's society and how busy we are, people tend to just follow the news. They click on everything on social media. They go, oh, that's interesting, but they don't go and then they fact check. So the partisan audience. So Americans increasingly rely on sources that communicate information aligned with what they believe. So within this, we see this thing called echo chambers, especially with social media. So basically what this is, it's that it's like back in 2016, 2017, when people started becoming more partisan, polarized, meaning they leaned more Republican, more Democrat. They started unfriending people who didn't follow their political beliefs and or they blocked their notifications. So they didn't see them on their feed, right? So what happens with that is you have something known as an echo chamber, which means that all you're hearing is your own beliefs echo back at you. So this has worsened partisan polarization because each party is becoming more extreme. And the things you see happen in government, things like civil rights amendments, things like women's rights amendments, things like how the government operates, that mirrors a lot of what is going on in society. And so those patterns tend to follow what is going on in society. So just like how our American citizens are becoming more partisan polarized, so too are the political parties within our government system. You could say that they feed off of each other, right? As the parties become more polarized, so do the people, and vice versa, right? But another thing is that exposure to partisan outlets lead people to be more politically interested and engaged. So at the same time, it warps understanding of the opposing party and generally generates hostility. So you see this a lot with, especially if you watch different news clips of CNN and Fox, and they're constantly pointing the finger back at each other, right? They're constantly blaming each other for each thing. They do this to keep people politically interested and engaged and to also keep their support for their party. And so heavy exposure to partisan outlets often fosters distrust of the traditional media and of political institutions generally. Because what happens is, especially if the party in power does not match the news station that you are watching. So let's say if you're watching Fox and the party in power is the Democrats, or you're watching CNN and the party in power is the Republicans, they tend to foster a lot of distrust in our political institutions because the other party is constantly doing the quote wrong thing, right? They're always blaming each other. So this also, though, affects people's understanding and it affects people's support of how the government actually works. Whenever you've taken a class like this, right, you can take what presidents have said, you can take what news outlets have said, and you can place blame where it actually goes, or maybe see, oh, well, you're talking about this, and the president doing this, but that's actually under Congress, so why are they blaming the president for that? And you're able to see those different things, right? But people who have not taken a class like this and or maybe haven't studied politics in a while or what have you tend to forget about those things and or don't know about those things. And so our news stations tend to rely on that because then they can blame something on a political institution that has absolutely no fault. Or they can say a political institution could do something that they can't. And people who haven't taken a class like this or studied politics in a while might not be able to call them out on it, right? So as you can see, I'm not lying. The conflicting ideas living in different worlds. So MSNBC, remember this is like our CNN, they lean very Democrat, very liberal. Fox News, they lean very Republican, very conservative. As you can see, a lot of people live in those echo chambers, meaning they are watching the same thing and getting the same information with the same viewpoints, okay? Both sides. And this has contributed hugely to our partisan polarization, okay? So, last slide for today. So, the period before cable TV was marked by inadvertent viewers. So, basically what this means is that we only had like 2 or 3 channels on the television at first. So, children would be able to just change a channel, watch cartoons what they wanted to, or go to Netflix like they can now, right? So, advent of the television was a huge deal. People would stand outside of different stores and storefronts, and they'd watch the TV that was within the display shelf and just watch what was going on. It was a huge thing. And so children tended to watch the news. Even at the age of 5 or 6, they would watch the news because that was all that was on TV, and they were amazed at even being able to see something like a TV. So today's those without an interest have no difficulty finding other types of programs. So we've seen a decline in news consumption. Your book says you've seen a decline in news consumption. Again, I tend to disagree. But they do have the ability to change the channel, especially if it's something that they don't agree with. And people do, especially whenever they get tired of all the political bickering going back and forth. They just change the channel and watch another show, right? So increased media multitasking has led to reduced ability to concentrate on any particular message. So we see different sources and conflicting messages increase the likelihood of confusion and misunderstanding. And then also people, multitasking while they're watching the news, so they're kind of just barely paying attention. You're doing your work while you're watching TV, while you're watching your kids, while you're making dinner, and all these different things, right? Okay, so that's it for today. I have this meeting recorded both on Microsoft Teams. As soon as I get it loaded through my screen recorder, I will